Sign the transfer deed, or I will make sure you never see a cent of what Grandpa left. Not 1 cent, Renata. My aunt said that to me standing in the kitchen of the house I grew up visiting every summer, the house my grandfather built with his own hands in Kelowna, BC. The house he left to me. I didn't say anything back. I just stood there holding my mug of coffee, watching her face, and I thought, she actually believes she's going to win this. I should back up. My grandfather, I called him dziadek, the Polish word for grandpa, passed away in February, about 8 months before any of this happened. He was 81. He'd been in good health until the last year when his heart started giving out in small, polite increments. The way he did everything. He didn't make a scene about dying, he just got quieter, and then one morning he didn't wake up. He left me the house in Kelowna. Not my mother, not my Aunt Sylvia, not my cousin Brett, who had been hovering around Ziadek the last 2 years like a crow on a fence post. Me, his granddaughter, the one who drove up from Vancouver every long weekend to sit with him, help him with the garden, eat his beet soup, and listen to his stories about arriving in Canada in 1971 with $40 and a suitcase held shut with a belt. He left it to me in a will that was drafted by a notary in Kelowna, signed in front of 2 witnesses, and filed with the BC Vital Statistics Agency. Completely legal, completely clear. That's when my family decided I had somehow cheated. My mother called me 2 days after the will was read, not to say she was hurt, not even to say she was surprised. She called to tell me I needed to do the right thing and transfer the property into a joint trust with her and Aunt Sylvia. She said Ziadek had been confused in his last years. She said he didn't understand what he was signing. She said a lot of things, and underneath all of them was the real sentence. The house is worth $1.1 million, and we want our share. I said I'd think about it. I needed time to process losing him, I said. She seemed to accept that. She didn't accept it for long. By April, the calls had shifted. My mother and aunt were calling together sometimes from the same phone, taking turns. My cousin Brett texted me things like, "Family is supposed to share," and "You know this is wrong, Ren." My uncle Gordon, who I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, suddenly emailed me a long message about our family's history and values. The pressure was constant, low-level, relentless. The kind that doesn't feel like pressure until you realize you haven't slept well in 6 weeks. My husband, Owen, noticed before I did. He's the kind of person who doesn't say much, but when he does, it's worth listening to. One night in May, he put down his book and said, "I think you need to talk to a lawyer before you talk to any of them again." I called a real estate and estate lawyer in Vancouver that week. Her name was Margaret, and she had the kind of calm, professional manner that makes you feel like whatever disaster you're describing is something she's seen 50 times before. She looked at the will, looked at the title documents, and told me the estate was properly executed. If my family wanted to challenge it, they would have to go to BC Supreme Court and prove testamentary incapacity or undue influence. "Do they have evidence of either?" she asked. They didn't. Dziadek had been assessed by his own family doctor 6 months before he died. He was sharp. He knew what he owned and who he wanted to have it. Margaret told me to stop engaging with the family pressure informally. Document everything. Don't make promises. Don't apologize. And if anyone asked me to sign anything, not without her reviewing it first. I went back to the Kelowna house in June, partly to sort through some of Dziadek's things, partly because Owen and I were thinking about whether to keep it or sell. I'd been putting off the decision because every time I thought about it, I thought about him, and that was still too close. I didn't tell anyone in the family I was going. Aunt Sylvia found out anyway. She lives 40 minutes from Kelowna, in a suburb that feels like every suburb. The kind with a Tim Hortons on every corner, and a Costco you can see from the highway. She showed up at the house on the second day I was there, pulling into the driveway in her Jeep like she had been invited. She came inside without being asked. She made tea in Ziadek's kitchen like it was her own. She sat across from me at his table and talked for a long time about how hard this had been on the family, how much they had all loved him, how unfair it was that one person got everything when there were so many people who cared. I listened. I didn't say much. I remembered what Owen said, and what Margaret said, and I kept my face neutral. Then Aunt Sylvia put a folder on the table. Inside was a document, a deed of gift transferring a 50% interest in the Kelowna property to a family trust, with her and my mother as co-trustees. She slid it across the table with a pen on top of it. "This is the right thing," she said. "You know it is." I looked at the document. I didn't touch the pen. I said I would have my lawyer look at it. Her face changed. That's when she said it. "Sign the transfer deed, or I will make sure you never see a cent of what Grandpa left." She said they had proof the will wasn't valid. She said Brett had been there when Zayadek admitted he'd been pressured by me into changing his will. She said the family was prepared to go to court and tie the estate up for years if I didn't sign. I picked up my coffee mug. I took a slow sip. I set it down. "I'll be in touch," I said. She left. I sat at Zayadek's table for a long time after her Jeep backed out of the driveway. The kitchen smelled the way it always had. Old wood, coffee, something faintly like the dried herbs he kept in jars along the window. I looked at the folder she'd left on the table. Then I took out my phone and called Owen. "They showed up," I said. "I know," he said. "Come home." "Not yet." I photographed every page of the document Aunt Sylvia had left. I sent the photos to Margaret. Then I looked around the kitchen, at the jars of herbs, at the hand-painted calendar still showing February, at the small framed photo of Giadek and me from the summer I was 12, standing in the garden with dirt on our knees. And I made a decision. I wasn't signing anything, and I wasn't going to be quiet about this anymore. Margaret called me back that evening. The deed of gift Sylvia had brought was drafted by a real estate agent, not a lawyer, which meant it had errors in it, but also meant someone had paid to have it prepared, which meant this had been planned for a while. She told me to formally put my family members on notice that any further contact regarding the property should go through her office. She drafted a letter that week. My mother called me 2 days later, furious. "You're getting lawyers involved in the family," she said, as if the family hadn't already gotten itself involved in a legal document. Zayadek would be ashamed. I said, "Zayadek chose me, that's in writing." She hung up. The silence that followed felt almost worse than the calls. I knew they weren't done. I knew Brett and his father Gordon were the kind of people who needed to feel like they'd won something. And I knew Aunt Sylvia had too much invested in this, emotionally, financially, in terms of her own pride, to just let it go. What I didn't know, and what I should have seen coming, was where the real attack would come from. In late July, Margaret called me with something new. A caveat had been filed against the property title. A caveat in BC means someone is claiming an interest in the land and wants to freeze any sale or transfer until the claim is resolved. It's not a lawsuit, not yet, but it's a flag on the title that makes it impossible to sell or refinance. The caveat had been filed by my cousin Brett on the basis that he claimed Zayadek had verbally promised him a share of the property. A verbal promise, no document, no witnesses named, just Brett's word. Margaret told me we could apply to the BC Supreme Court to have the caveat removed, and that given the lack of any written evidence, we had a strong case. But it would take time and money, probably 4 to 6 months, probably $8,000 to $12,000 in legal fees. I sat with that for a day. Then I called Margaret and told her to file the application. This is the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been through it. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being the person who did nothing wrong, who just received what they were given, and who still has to spend thousands of dollars and months of their life defending it. Owen and I had to dip into savings. I had to take time off work. I'm a project coordinator for a construction firm, and the weeks I spent dealing with lawyers and documents and court filings were weeks I wasn't fully present anywhere. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. I had headaches that wouldn't go away. Owen made dinner most nights. He didn't complain. He just handed me a plate and sat across from me, and sometimes he didn't say anything at all. Just kept me company in the silence, and I don't know if he understands how much that meant. Margaret told me later that she'd seen this pattern before in estate disputes, what she called grief weaponized. The family members who felt entitled didn't necessarily want the property more than I did. They wanted to feel like they hadn't been passed over. They wanted to feel chosen. And because Ziyadek had chosen me, I became the obstacle between them and that feeling. The legal challenge wasn't really about the house. It was about not being able to accept that he'd made a decision they disagreed with. That didn't make it easier, but it helped me stop taking it personally. Mostly. The caveat hearing was scheduled for October. About 3 weeks before it, something happened that I wasn't expecting. Ziyadek's next-door neighbor, a woman named Helise who had lived beside him for 20 years and who I had known my whole childhood as the woman who brought him pierogies at Christmas, called me out of the blue. She said she'd heard through the local rumor mill that the family was fighting over the house. She said she wanted me to know something. She said that the previous spring, about 2 months before Ziyadek died, he had asked her to witness something for him. She had come to his house, and he had showed her a letter, handwritten, 2 pages, signed and dated. In the letter, he explained in his own words why he was leaving the house to me. He described our relationship. He described what he called his clear mind and full intention. He described specifically that he had spoken to my mother and aunt about his decision and that he did not want anyone to claim he had been pressured or confused. He had asked Helise to keep a copy. She still had it. She asked if I wanted her to send it to my lawyer. I said yes, and then I had to sit down. I don't fully know how to describe what I felt. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't that clean. It was something closer to grief mixed with gratitude. He had known. He had anticipated that this would happen, and he had quietly, without telling me, done what he could to protect me from it. That was so completely him. That was the man who had shown up to every soccer game I played as a kid, who had taught me to drive in a parking lot in Kelowna when I was 15, who had called me every Sunday evening for as long as I could remember, just to check in, just to hear my voice. He had known his family, and he had loved them, and he had known what they were capable of, and he had still chosen me, and then he had made sure I would be okay. Margaret received the letter from Helise within the week. She reviewed it, had it authenticated, and told me this changed the landscape of the case significantly, not just for the caveat hearing. The letter also served as direct rebuttal of any undue influence or testamentary incapacity claim if the family tried to escalate to a full challenge. The caveat hearing was held in Vancouver in late October. Brett did not appear in person. His father Gordon appeared with a lawyer they had hired from Kelowna. The judge reviewed the caveat application, the will, the notary records, the doctor's capacity assessment, and Ziyadek's letter. Brett's lawyer argued that the verbal promise created an equitable interest in the land. Margaret argued with documentation that no such promise was evidenced in writing, that Ziyadek had been fully capacitated when he made his estate decisions, and that the caveat had been filed as a pressure tactic, not a legitimate legal claim. The judge removed the caveat. Brett's legal claim was dismissed. Costs were awarded against him. I was sitting in the courthouse hallway when Margaret came out and told me. I didn't cry. I'd used up most of the crying in the months before that. I just nodded and said, okay. And then I texted Owen, it's done. He texted back 3 words, come home, Ren. The fallout in the family was what you'd expect and what you'd also not quite be able to prepare for. My mother called me once after the decision, a short call. She said she hoped we could eventually find a way back to each other. She didn't apologize. I told her I hoped so too, and I meant it, even though I didn't know if it was possible. Aunt Sylvia sent me an email that I read once and then archived without responding to. Brett, to my knowledge, has not reached out. Gordon sent a note to Owen, not to me, saying he thought the whole thing had gotten out of hand. Owen replied, politely, that he agreed, and that the person who could have stopped it at any point was the one who filed the caveat. We didn't hear back. I drove up to Kelowna in November. Just me. Owen offered to come, but I wanted to do this part alone. I walked through the house room by room, the way I had when I was a kid. I opened the windows even though it was cold. I went out to the garden which had gone to seed for the season, and I stood there for a while looking at the mountains. I called Helise. She came over with tea and her dog, an ancient beagle named Walter, who immediately fell asleep on my feet. We sat in the kitchen and she told me stories about Ziyadek that I hadn't heard before. About the time he'd fixed her fence without being asked. About the way he'd always wave from the driveway before getting his mail. About the last summer, when he'd sit on the back step in the evenings and she'd sit on hers, and they'd just be there together, not talking, watching the light go down over the valley. He talked about you a lot, she said. He was proud of you. Not in a big way, in a quiet way. The way he was proud of things. I looked down at Walter asleep on my feet, and I thought about all the Sunday evening calls I wouldn't get anymore. I know, I said. I know he was. Owen and I decided to keep the house. We'll use it in the summers. Maybe rent it part of the year. Eventually, I think, we'll move there properly. There's something about that valley, about the light in the early morning when the lake is still and the Okanagan Hills are going orange and gold, that I can't let go of. Zayadek couldn't either. He built a life there from nothing, with $40 and a suitcase and a stubbornness that I apparently inherited. I've stopped waiting for the family to come around. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. What I know is that I did what he asked me to do. I held on. I didn't fold when the pressure was enormous and the cost was real, and the people who were supposed to love me were lined up on the other side. And somewhere in that house, in the jars of dried herbs along the kitchen window and the hand-painted calendar and the garden going quiet under the November frost, he is still there. Choosing me. Leaving something behind that meant something. Peace was the hardest thing he ever asked me to protect, and it was worth every single cent. I still think about the moment Helise called me. How I was standing in Zayadek's kitchen, not knowing what I was going to do next. And then the phone rang and everything shifted. Not because someone saved me, but because someone who had nothing to gain chose to do the right thing anyway. That's the part that stays with me. People talk about karma like it's a vending machine. You do good, good comes back, transaction complete. I don't think it works that way. What I think is simpler and harder at the same time. The choices we make have weight, and eventually that weight lands somewhere. My Aunt Sylvia made a choice to file a caveat she knew wasn't grounded in anything real. Brett made a choice to put his name on a claim he couldn't support. They made those choices because they thought pressure and legal paperwork could substitute for having an actual case. And in the end, every one of those choices came back to them. Not as punishment exactly, but as consequence. As the natural result of building something on nothing. Zayadek made choices too. He chose to be honest about his intentions in writing, unprompted 2 months before he died. He chose to ask a neighbor to keep a copy. He didn't tell me he'd done it. He just did it. Quietly. The way he did most things. That decision, made alone in his kitchen in the last winter of his life, is what protected me 8 months later in a courthouse in Vancouver. Integrity doesn't expire. It waits. I made choices too, and I won't pretend they were always easy or that I was always sure. There were nights I thought about just signing the document to make it stop. The legal fees were real. The stress was real. The grief underneath all of it, the grief I barely had time to feel because I was too busy defending what he'd left me. That was the most real thing of all. What kept me from folding wasn't stubbornness. It was that I knew, clearly and without doubt, that what I was protecting was right. Knowing that gave me something to stand on when everything else felt unsteady. That kind of clarity, the ability to look at a situation honestly and understand what's actually true, not just what's convenient, is something I had to work to hold on to. Some days it took everything I had. And then there was Owen. He didn't fight my battles. He didn't tell me what to do. He just made dinner, kept the lights on, and sat across from me in the silence when I had nothing left to say. There's a kind of strength in that, in the person who stays present without making it about themselves, that I don't think I appreciated fully until I needed it. What I know now, on the other side of it, is that none of the things that mattered were dramatic. The will was legal because Zayadek had been honest. The caveat failed because Heloise had done the right thing. The case held because I hadn't signed anything I shouldn't have. Every good outcome traced back to a small, undramatic act of doing what was right when it would have been easier not to. That's what I want to carry forward. Not the victory, not the house, not the vindication. Though I'm not going to pretend those don't matter. What I want to carry is the understanding that how you move through things shapes what you're able to hold on to when they're over. Zayadek knew that. You lived it for 81 years. I'm still learning.